Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing into one of the strangest corners of history, the Victorian wife sale. Tonight you'll be falling asleep to the soothing sounds of public auctions, marital mischief, and a society so confused by its own rules that, at one point, men thought the best way to end a marriage was to sell their wife at the local cattle market. Forget swiping left. Forget awkward divorce paperwork. This is honey. Grab your bonnet. You're about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. So, before you snuggle in, please take a second to like and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, because if you're hearing this at 2 a.m, just know, at least you're not up for auction in a muddy field somewhere outside Birmingham. Now, dim the lights, turn on that fan for some gentle white noise, and get comfortable, preferably not on the same straw mattress Victorian peasants used. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what would drive a man to march into the marketplace and sell his spouse with a rope around her waist? What exactly do you say when you're haggling over your partner's starting bid? Was there an etiquette for buyer's remorse in 1832? And for the wives, what did it feel like being paraded between the livestock and the turnip vendor? Did you at least get to keep the dog? And most importantly, how did a society obsessed with hats and calling everyone dear invent one of the weirdest DIY divorce methods in history? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1850s England. Your marriage is complicated, your husband is eyeing up the auctioneer, and your in-laws are here for the spectacle. Good luck. It's a grey, damp morning in Victorian England. You wake beside your spouse and realise, once again, you've got less in common than a parlour plant and a coal scuttle. Divorce is expensive, scandalous, and might require actual paperwork. Luckily, the neighbours already mentioned a creative solution. Your eyes blink open to the sound of rain pattering on the soot-stained window. The fire in the grate is nothing but a memory, and your breath fogs in the air. You're sharing a lumpy straw mattress with the same person you've been sharing it with for what feels like centuries, a person who is now somehow simultaneously snoring and glaring at you. You pull the thin wool blanket closer, trying not to think about how much it smells like boiled cabbage and disappointment. Outside, a cart rattles down the cobblestone street, its wheels clattering out a tune that sounds suspiciously like congratulations on your ongoing misery. You try to ignore your spouse's morning routine, which today consists of coughing, muttering, and performing a series of noises so complex you wonder if you've accidentally married a brass band. Every morning begins like this: two people trapped together by fate, finances, and the world's most confusing legal system. You stare at the water stain on the ceiling and debate which will come first: divorce reform or the ceiling collapsing in a burst of damp Victorian optimism. There's no such thing as sleeping in. Not unless you count those rare moments between the rooster crowing and the neighbour's children howling like banshees over who gets the last stale crust. Your spouse rolls over, pulls the blanket, and mumbles something about your turn for the privy, which in Victorian England is the equivalent of Happy Monday. The love boat has sailed, and it's been replaced by a leaky dinghy. You get up, bones creaking, and shuffle into the kitchen. The floor is cold. Your socks are damp. You step on a stray potato and briefly wonder if anyone would notice if you just kept walking, all the way to Liverpool, perhaps. Breakfast is waiting. Yesterday's bread and a mug of weak, sad tea, its flavour profile somewhere between rainwater and regret. Your spouse plunks down across from you, their entire posture radiating the energy of a person who has just realised they are contractually obligated to see your face for another several decades. You look around at your tiny, fogged-up world. The dishes haven't been washed, the coal scuttle is empty, and the air smells like old onions and the death of romance. Somewhere outside, your neighbour is whistling God Save the Queen while hanging laundry, and you catch her peering through her curtains, always ready to offer unsolicited advice. Last week, she suggested a good public auction does wonders for a stagnant relationship, and you're still not sure if she meant furniture or spouses. Divorce, of course, is out of reach. It requires an Act of Parliament, roughly the GDP of Cornwall, and the social stamina to withstand the judgment of every person you've ever met, including your childhood goldfish. Instead, you make do. You share space, bread, and the kind of simmering silence that could curdle milk. Sometimes you both remember why you married in the first place, but most days it's like living in a never-ending game of who can sigh the loudest. You sit in the dim morning light, hands wrapped around your mug, and contemplate the options. You could run away. You could fake your own death and join the circus. Or just maybe, you could listen to the neighbor's advice and see what all this wife sale business is about. At the very least, it would make a change from arguing about whose turn it is to scrub the privy. But for now, you just sip your tea, pull your shawl tighter, and wait for another grey Victorian day to begin, married and miserable, but at least not alone. In a world where just touching hands before marriage could end a reputation, legally separating was reserved for those with deep pockets and no shame. For everyone else, the options were suffer, elope, or get creative at the market. Let's paint the scene. It's Victorian England, a place where the idea of irreconcilable differences is met with the same suspicion you'd give someone selling miracle hair tonic out of a hatbox. In polite society, marriage is a one-way ticket, and the return journey is reserved exclusively for the aristocracy, the certifiably mad, and the sort of people who can afford to throw a lavish party just to announce that they're absolutely miserable. For the rest of us, dissolving a marriage is like trying to cancel your cable subscription. Expensive, emotionally draining, and you still end up with a bill. You, of course, are not a duke, duchess, or even a distant cousin to a baron. Your entire savings are tied up in 3 mismatched spoons, a jar of dubious jam, and a coal allowance that runs out in February. But somewhere, a select few are actually navigating the choppy waters of divorce with the help of lawyers, barristers, and enough paperwork to wallpaper Buckingham Palace. Divorce, if you're lucky enough to qualify, starts with a parliamentary act. Yes, Parliament, the same people debating the price of tea and whether trousers should be considered scandalous. You'll need witnesses, proof of wrongdoing, and an attorney who won't faint from shame halfway through your testimony. No-fault divorce? Dream on. Adultery, abuse, and outright villainy. Those are the only tickets out, and even then, only if you can afford to broadcast your dirty laundry to the entire nation. If you're middle class or below, your options shrink faster than a wool waistcoat in a hot wash. You might try an informal separation, but this comes with all the legality of a pinky promise and about as much long-term success. Most likely, you're left living under the same roof, mastering the fine art of passive-aggressive tea pouring and communicating exclusively through loud sighs and ominous silence. It's not so much a marriage as it is an endurance sport. Eloping is another possibility if you fancy being disowned, cut off, and forced to hide out in Gretna Green, Scotland's one-stop shop for desperate lovers and very patient blacksmiths. Elopement is less a romantic getaway and more a logistical nightmare involving trains, angry relatives, and the prospect of spending your honeymoon hiding behind a stack of horseshoes. For the bold, or perhaps the creatively desperate, there's always the market. The wife's sale, as odd as it sounds, offered a loophole, at least in the eyes of a few sympathetic or just lazy local officials. Here's how it works. Rather than drag your heartache through the courts, you simply parade your spouse to the local fair, auction block, or cattle market. Tie a ribbon or rope around their waist and let the bidding begin. If this sounds like selling your problems to the highest bidder, that's because it is. Legally binding? Not at all. Socially acceptable? Only if you do it discreetly, and even then, only if nobody's favourite vicar happens to be passing by. It's worth mentioning that for many, the wife sale wasn't just an act of male desperation, it was a mutual escape route. Sometimes both parties were in on it. Sometimes the buyer was a lover, a friend, or just someone with a working stove, and no strong opinions about snoring. The real miracle isn't that people sold their spouses. It's that society mostly shrugged and said, well, At least it's not another scandal about the Prince of Wales. So, as you stare at the cracked ceiling above your shared marital misery, remember, in Victorian England, divorce is a luxury, not a right. If you want out, you'll need to be filthy rich, incredibly bold, or just comfortable with being the star attraction at the next market day. Sleep tight, and remember, love may be eternal, but legal separation not so much. Picture the local market. Livestock, vegetables, and a crowd gathering not for the finest carrots, but to see who's being sold this week. Auctions aren't just for sheep and pigs. Sometimes it's Mrs. Smith. You shuffle into the heart of the town, feet sinking into the familiar mud of market day, trying not to think about the smell of turnips and something vaguely like regret. Around you, the stalls are stacked high with knobbly potatoes, limp cabbages, and a row of chickens looking as fed up with their lot as you are with yours. But today, there's more excitement than usual. There's no festival, no travelling magician, just a marriage on the rocks and the chance for the public to witness the world's least romantic separation. You squeeze past a pair of sheep debating escape, a man with suspiciously large ears hawking meat pies, and at least 3 children trying to sell you a handful of damp chestnuts. The air is thick with anticipation. This isn't just a day to buy onions and bread. It's a spectator sport, and everyone's a critic. Somewhere near the fountain, a crude wooden platform has been erected. Not for public speeches or rousing town announcements. No, this is the unofficial auction block, where unfortunate couples become the talk of the town again. You'd think the crowd would be embarrassed, but this is Victorian England. Embarrassment is for people with options. Spectators arrive early, elbowing for the best view, as though they're queuing for theatre tickets. Mrs. Butterworth, the baker's wife, is here, munching a jam tart and narrating the action for anyone who'll listen. Old Mr. Pickering, who's never missed a sale, sets up a folding stool for comfort. Even the local constable is lingering nearby, just in case the bidding gets too spirited. Or perhaps he just wants first dibs on a bargain. Standing in the centre, Mrs. Smith herself, roped politely at the waist, more resigned than distressed, gives you a tight, practiced smile. This isn't her first rodeo. Her soon-to-be ex-husband fidgets awkwardly at her side, waving a scrap of paper that may or may not be an official bill of sale. It's equal parts tragedy, farce, and public spectacle. Sort of like announcing your divorce on Facebook, except with more mud and fewer inspirational quotes about self-care. The auctioneer, who doubles as the evening's pub pianist, steps forward, clearing his throat. He launches into his pitch. One wife, strong constitution, can knit a scarf in under an hour. Any offers? You realize with mild horror that this is all completely normal. Bids start flying. Sometimes it's for a few shillings, sometimes for a piglet, sometimes for the promise of fresh bread and a life less ordinary. The market is alive with sound. Vendors haggling, babies wailing, someone loudly inquiring whether Mrs. Smith comes with a tea set. You can barely hear yourself think over the din. The crowd reacts to every bid like it's the highlight of the season, gasping, murmuring, and making notes for their own marriages. It's reality TV, Victorian edition. Tune in next week for Who Wants to Be a Spouse Millionaire? As a bystander, you might feel uncomfortable, but let's be honest, you're not leaving. No one ever does. The market isn't just for groceries. It's where reputations are made, gossip is born, and sometimes, when all goes well, someone actually leaves with a better future, or at least with a decent leg of lamb. Occasionally, the wife is bought by a lover, a friend, or someone who just really needs help with laundry. Sometimes she's thrilled, sometimes she sighs, and sometimes, just sometimes, she haggles up her own price. The sale is never really about money. It's about hope, escape, and the strange Victorian optimism that says, surely next time will be better. And as you trudge home, bread in hand and gossip in your pocket, you wonder, was that justice, humiliation, or just another day in the marketplace, where marriages come to die and everyone goes home with something, sometimes a cabbage, sometimes a clean slate. It's wife sale day. You're led to the market with a rope around your waist, a crowd of amused onlookers, and at least 3 people already placing side bets. There's ale everywhere, because nothing says public marriage auction like a good pint. Let's talk about the rope first. It's not exactly a designer accessory. No frills, no bows, just a length of scratchy hemp tied a little too snugly, looping awkwardly around your middle. It's the Victorian version of relationship status. It's complicated, and I'm currently up for bids. You shuffle through the puddles, cold feet numb from both nerves and the damp English morning. Your soon-to-be ex-husband is a few steps behind, alternating between bravado and regret, depending on who's watching. You'd like to think you have some dignity left, but the crowd has other plans. Children dart through your path, trying to guess your final price. The local butcher yells something encouraging about a good strong lass who can pluck a chicken in her sleep. Somewhere, an accordion starts up, as if the whole thing needs a soundtrack. There's a certain logic to holding the sale at the market. After all, it's the social hub, a place where everyone knows your name, your family secrets, and now, apparently, your marital prospects. The pub is next door, and half the town has already taken advantage of the special on ale for awkward public spectacles. You inhale deeply, immediately regret it. Someone is frying onions, and wonder how your life reached this point. The auction itself is surprisingly formal. The auctioneer stands atop a crate, his coat only slightly less muddy than the street. He clears his throat, sways gently from side to side. He's also had some ale, and announces your marital resume with the enthusiasm of a man who's seen it all and would rather be seeing less. One wife, excellent with turnips, can recite the Lord's Prayer backward if sufficiently provoked. Comes with or without apron. Current owner downsizing due to creative differences. Bidding begins. It's all very civilized, if you ignore the heckling from the peanut gallery. The local cobbler opens with 2 shillings and a sack of potatoes. Old Mrs. Blank Too-Hard, Cratchit, who hasn't had a day's peace since her own husband accidentally sold her in '39, offers half a loaf of bread and a stern warning. Somewhere in the back, someone offers a goat if she'll do the milking. There are cheers, jeers, and at least one dramatic gasp from your neighbour, who can't decide if she's scandalised or just jealous that someone else thought of it first. Every so often, the ale makes things more interesting. The bids get bolder, the jokes louder, and soon people are arguing about whether you're worth more than a spring lamb or likely to eat less. You make eye contact with a stranger near the vegetable stall. He gives you a subtle nod, as if to say, "Don't worry, this is all perfectly normal," by Victorian standards. You find yourself wondering if his boots leak as much as your current husband's. Through it all, you can't help but feel a strange mix of humiliation and relief. Sure, you're the main event at the town's most questionable party, but there's also hope. Maybe your next chapter will involve fewer arguments about coal rations and more about, well, literally anything else. You try to keep your posture dignified, which is difficult when you're being described like a particularly plucky chicken. The auctioneer gives the traditional closing call. Going once, going twice. You glance at your soon-to-be former spouse. He shrugs, gives you an awkward half-smile, and for a moment you almost laugh. At least you'll have a story to tell, provided you get to keep the dog. So, as the crowd cheers, the ale sloshes, and the rope around your waist is passed to a new, hopeful owner, you realize the Victorian wife sale isn't just about endings. It's about bad decisions, unexpected beginnings, and the fine art of making the best of a truly peculiar situation. Good luck. The auctioneer wipes his nose, squints at your husband, and bellows out your vital statistics like you're a slightly disappointing sheep. The bidding war is not what you dreamed about on your wedding night. Standing on the makeshift platform, you get the uncomfortable sensation that you've become the human equivalent of yesterday's bread. Technically still useful, but no one's entirely sure what for. The auctioneer, resplendent in his patched coat and mismatched boots, clears his throat with the gravitas of a man who once sold a prize pig for 3 times its value and still talks about it. Today, however, his task is a little more delicate, a little more awkward, and, from the look on his face, not nearly as lucrative. He begins his introduction. Right then we have here one wife, sturdy of build, rumoured to make a fine turnip stew, and reportedly able to recite all the psalms during a thunderstorm. He glances over at you, then at your husband, who manages to look both apologetic and hopeful, as though he's just realised he left the oven on at home. The crowd leans in, their faces a mix of curiosity and barely disguised glee. A few hold small slips of paper, ready to make notes as though this is the highlight of their week. Maybe it is. "Let's start the bidding at 1 shilling, the auctioneer calls out, his voice echoing over the cabbage cart and the ever-present chorus of background hecklers. There's a shuffling of boots. Someone coughs. An optimistic hand goes up, your neighbour, Mrs. Gubbins, offering a basket of onions and a well-worn recipe for rhubarb pudding. The auctioneer pauses, as if weighing the merits of onions versus hard cash, and decides to accept. The bidding creeps up. A jug of ale, 3 chickens, 2 if you're not fussy, and a slightly used pair of boots. You're hyper-aware of every whispered conversation. Did you hear she knits socks by the dozen? I heard she refuses to milk the cow after sundown. I'd bid, but I've already got my hands full with Agnes. You can't decide if you're insulted or relieved by the attention. At least no one's asked for a refund, yet. The auctioneer, sensing the energy needs a boost, leans into the drama. Strong back. Quick with a broom. Never once burned the Sunday roast that we know of. A few more hands go up, including a suspiciously eager stranger from the next village over. There's a flutter of excitement when someone offers a small pig, but your husband shakes his head. Apparently he draws the line at livestock smaller than the family dog. Through it all, you try to maintain some dignity, which is no small feat when your life is being appraised by the same people who argued about the price of cabbages last week. You find yourself wondering what's worse, being passed over entirely, or having the highest bid come from old Mr. Higgs, whose last wife mysteriously disappeared after winning the town bake-off. Finally, as the auctioneer's voice begins to crack from the exertion, or maybe just from the second-hand embarrassment, he prepares to close the sale. Last chance now. Going once, going twice. The crowd leans in, breath held, as if expecting fireworks or at least a mild scandal. Your heart thumps in your chest, but mostly you just want to get out of the drizzle and into some dry socks. A final bid comes in, 2 shillings and a promise of Sunday dinner. The auctioneer, satisfied, bangs his gavel, or, in this case, a wooden spoon, and announces the end of the bidding. The rope around your waist is ceremoniously handed over to your new owner, and the crowd erupts in applause, laughter, and a few muttered complaints about the price of ale. It's not exactly the fairy tale ending you'd imagined, but as you step down from the block, you realise you've survived the auctioneer's cry, the crowd's scrutiny, and the absurdity of Victorian marriage, all in one soggy afternoon. And as you follow your new fate down the muddy lane, you can't help but hope that next time, at least, you'll get to keep the onions. No, wife selling wasn't really legal, but as long as you didn't cause a riot, nobody seemed too bothered. The local magistrate is conveniently out to lunch, again. It's one of those peculiar features of Victorian England where the law exists in thick, leather-bound volumes, but daily life is ruled by a much squishier concept called everyone just pretends it's fine. On paper, Parliament and every self-respecting judge in London would clutch their pearls at the notion of selling your spouse next to the rutabagas. But in practice, as long as the sale didn't get out of hand, and nobody started brawling with the fishmonger, local authorities had a remarkable ability to develop sudden selective blindness. You, of course, are now at the centre of this legal grey area, which is less innocent until proven guilty and more let's not ask questions, and maybe it'll sort itself out. The auctioneer winks at you. The constable, who's supposed to be upholding public morals, is instead helping himself to a free ale and muttering about the importance of community harmony. Everyone is very invested in not rocking the boat, especially since the last time someone challenged a wife sale. It ended with a pie fight, and 3 people accidentally engaged to each other. Officially, English law since the 1750s had frowned, scowled, and occasionally thundered against the sale of wives. The courts called it illegal and void, and anyone caught making a public spectacle out of marital misery could, in theory, be fined or imprisoned. But the key phrase here is in theory. In reality, the people who enforce the rules live in the same village as the people breaking them. The local magistrate might be a cousin. The town bailiff's mother could be first in line to bid. Nobody really wants to see Uncle Reg go to jail for buying a new wife when he's already so bad at cooking. You can almost see the invisible script everyone is following. The sale is held just far enough away from the church steps to avoid a stern lecture from the vicar. There's a rope involved, but it's loose and symbolic, more suggested guideline than actual restraint. Someone might even produce a scribbled bill of sale, which is legally meaningless but looks official if you squint and have had 2 pints of cider. When things go smoothly, everyone claps, nods approvingly, and goes home to tell their version of the story. If, however, things go sideways, a drunken brawl, a weeping mother-in-law, or a rival bidder with a grudge, suddenly the law springs to life. The constable dusts off his truncheon, the magistrate hurries back from his suspiciously long lunch, and everyone pretends to remember the actual rules. Someone will be scolded, perhaps fined, and the local newspaper will run a very stern editorial about maintaining public decency. But even then, punishments are usually mild, and life in the village returns to its regular schedule of gossip and damp weather. Sometimes, the authorities get creative. The judge might demand a formal apology, delivered in front of the mayor and a flock of unimpressed ducks. The sale could be nullified, only to take place again next week with a new batch of witnesses and a slightly better rope. Even the church, which theoretically disapproves of anything more scandalous than extra butter on Sunday, often just issues a sermon about the sanctity of marriage and hopes everyone forgets by Christmas. As you watch the scene unfold, you realize that legality is less about what's written in the law books and more about what the village can collectively tolerate. Victorian wife-selling exists in a kind of historical twilight, technically forbidden, practically ignored, and only really a problem if it makes too much noise. The rules are flexible, the consequences are negotiable, and the magistrate is always out to lunch when you need him most. So the next time you wonder if the law is on your side, just remember, in Victorian England, it probably depends on who's watching, how much ale is left, and whether the magistrate's lunch included pie. Were wives helpless victims, or surprisingly savvy negotiators? Sometimes, the merchandise was in on the plan, and occasionally orchestrated the entire event. Let's set the record straight. Not every Victorian wife sale was a scene of weeping and wailing, with a tearful woman being traded like a sack of turnips while the crowd cackled. Sometimes you, yes, you, the wife in question, were a willing, even eager participant. Picture yourself, years into a marriage that's as lifeless as last week's cabbage stew and just as hard to swallow. Your husband is no prize either. His idea of romance is remembering to leave you the dry end of the bread loaf. So, one grey morning, you and your spouse reach the rarest of agreements. Neither of you wants to continue pretending this is working. Divorce? Forget it. Your joint assets consist of a dented kettle, 3 mismatched spoons, and a pile of grievances so old they should have their own census entry. But there's a solution: the wife sale. Here's where things get interesting. You're not just putting up with it, you're helping plan the escape. Maybe you've already set your sights on the butcher, who, despite his tendency to smell like sausage, seems kind and only snores on alternate Thursdays. Maybe your heart belongs to the blacksmith, whose arms are strong enough to carry you, your hopes, and at least one of your 3 children. Or perhaps you're just ready to start over somewhere new, far from the shared memories of cold tea and colder conversation. The day arrives. You carefully select a dress that says bargain, but in a good way. You tie your bonnet with a flourish, check the rope for comfort. No one wants chafing on auction day, and you march to the market, head held high. Instead of shrinking from the stares, you meet them with a steely look that says, "Let's get this over with, shall we?" As the auctioneer begins, you nudge your husband, whispering, "Don't let him sell me for less than the cost of a goose, remember?" The crowd may be full of gossips and looky-loos, but you have a plan. The butcher knows to bid early and often, while your friend Martha is there to shout encouragement, or maybe raise the price a bit, just to see old Mrs. Prendergast's monocle pop out. Sometimes the negotiations get lively. Maybe you argue with your husband right there on the platform, haggling over the house cat or the family wash basin. If nothing else, it gives the crowd a show to talk about for weeks. Of course, not every wife had the luxury of agency. There were certainly sales where the wife wanted no part of it, where she felt more like livestock than human. But even then, some women found clever ways to assert themselves by refusing to step up, making a public scene, or simply outbidding the most obnoxious suitors with a well-timed insult. After all, a quick wit is sometimes more powerful than a purse full of shillings. In some towns, the wife's consent was quietly required. A sale wouldn't stick if the new couple didn't at least pretend to be on board. Sometimes, you'd negotiate the terms. Maybe you keep the good blanket. Maybe he takes the leaky tea kettle. Maybe the dog chooses for himself. In the end, it wasn't just about being bought and sold. It was about finding a new beginning, however odd the process. So, were wives merely objects, helpless in the hands of fate? Sometimes, yes. But just as often, you were a participant, a negotiator, and, on rare, wonderful occasions, the surprise mastermind. In a world where choices were limited, you learned to make your own, even if it meant being sold between the bread stall and the pig pen. You can't help but admire the resilience, and perhaps a little of the mischief, that it took to make history from the margins. Forget diamonds. Tonight, your value is somewhere between 2 shillings, a collie dog, and half a pint of cider. It's all about supply, demand, and whether you can make a decent stew. You stand on the damp cobblestones, rope at your waist, and glance nervously at the auctioneer, who's got the enthusiastic energy of a man who just sold his last goat and is ready to move on to bigger, if not exactly better, livestock. This is not exactly the glamorous market value you imagined growing up, but here you are, being appraised by the same townsfolk who once judged your jam at the village fair. Let's talk currency. In Victorian England, you quickly realise that money isn't the only thing changing hands at a wife sale. Sure, someone might open the bidding at a shiny silver shilling or two, but as the excitement builds, offers become more creative. Last week, old Tom Hardy bid 3 turnips, a jug of ale, and a promise to finally patch the village bridge. The town clerk once threw in a prize-winning chicken, and Mrs. Beasley, who hasn't cooked since the Crimean War, offered a half-finished meat pie if she comes with recipes. You listen to the auctioneer as he rattles off your qualities. Can sew, can scrub, and, on a good day, can tell a joke that won't make you question your existence. The crowd takes note. Someone shouts, "How's her rhubarb tart?" Another calls out, "Will she mind the sheep?" Suddenly, you're not a person, you're a bundle of helpful features and quirky extras, a living infomercial for Victorian domesticity. And then there's the bidding war itself. Modern dating apps may offer swipe right if you like dogs, but here, the actual presence of a dog is a negotiating chip. "I'll take her if she comes with that collie," someone cries, and the auctioneer nods, seriously weighing the pros and cons. Next, it's a cask of cider, a set of new boots, and, inevitably, a loaf of bread so fresh it still has the baker's thumbprint in it. You wonder if anyone's ever been traded for a particularly good wheel of cheese. Spoiler, they have. It's not just about household skills. Your value on the block goes up if you're known for keeping peace in the kitchen, singing nicely at church, or not having too many opinions about the neighbour's chickens. On the flip side, being fond of books, quick with a retort, or prone to midnight walks can make the price drop faster than the pub runs out of ale. It's a delicate Victorian balancing act. Be useful, be pleasant, but not so memorable you'll cause trouble at the next parish council meeting. For the men doing the bidding, this is the social event of the month. They compare notes on stew quality, stamina in the garden, and the ability to tolerate a snoring spouse. It's like Antiques Roadshow, but with more heckling and fewer guarantees. And if you're particularly unlucky, someone's bid will include a goat that turns out to have commitment issues. You'd think the church might have something to say about all this. And you'd be right. Somewhere nearby, the vicar is sighing into his sermon notes, quietly despairing at the state of modern marriage and wondering if his next speech should include a reminder that wives are not legal tender, even with bonus pie. By the end, the auctioneer accepts a final bid, 2 shillings, half a pint of cider, and the promise of Sunday lunch. You step down from the block, feeling oddly triumphant, if slightly underpriced. The crowd disperses, already gossiping about next week's potential lot. And you realize your worth wasn't in the coins, the cider, or even the collie dog, but in your ability to outlast, outwit, and occasionally outbid the entire town. And as the rain picks up, you can't help but think. In the Victorian marriage market, you might not get diamonds, but you'll always get a story worth telling. Nothing spreads faster than news of a wife sale, except maybe lice. The town paper prints the details. Your neighbour Agnes claims she saw everything, even though she never leaves her window. You'd think a marriage auction would be the sort of thing people might want to keep quiet, but in Victorian England, discretion is about as rare as a warm bath in February. By noon, the whole town knows you were up for sale, and by sunset, the story has grown legs, wings, and possibly a few extra heads. It's no longer just Mrs. Smith was sold to Mr. Jenkins for a collie and half a cider. It's become Mrs. Smith ran off with a mysterious stranger. The collie is actually a secret duke, and someone claims to have seen Queen Victoria herself bidding via carrier pigeon. It begins innocently enough. You leave the market, rope untied, your dignity more or less intact. But there's a ripple in the air. You pass the bakery, and the baker's wife raises an eyebrow, already making mental notes for her next round of cinnamon rolls, now with extra gossip. At the blacksmith's, the hammering slows just long enough for a whispered, "Did you hear?" And at the inn, even the usually stoic landlord has opinions, which he shares with everyone and anyone, provided they buy a pint first. Then there's the town paper, the Weekly Bugle, which arrives with the subtlety of a marching band on stilts. Its headline blares, "Wife sale stuns town, is true love dead?" The reporter, a man with a mustache so large it has its own zip code, writes with breathless excitement about the scandalous scene, the uproarious crowd, and one particularly dramatic goat. You can barely recognize yourself in his florid prose, but that doesn't stop him from spelling your name wrong 3 times. And then there's Agnes. Every neighbourhood has an Agnes, the unofficial chief of police, historian, and self-appointed binocular enthusiast. She never leaves her lace-curtained window, but somehow she knows everything. Who sneezed in church, who wore mismatched socks, and who bought whom for what at the market. Agnes's version of the story is both more dramatic and less accurate than the papers. She tells anyone who'll listen that you fainted on the auction block, revived only by the smell of fresh bread, and that your new husband arrived in a golden carriage. It was actually a wheelbarrow with peeling paint. You try to go about your business, but you're greeted everywhere by knowing winks, sly grins, and the occasional sympathetic pat on the shoulder from people you barely know. Children giggle as you walk by. Old men tip their hats and ask if you'll be giving tours of your new cottage. The grocer offers you a discount for being famous. Even the vicar seems a bit nervous around you, possibly fearing you'll auction off the choir next. Gossip isn't just confined to the village. Sometimes the story escapes, hitching a ride with the postman or an especially talkative pig farmer. Before long, a distant cousin writes from London, asking if it's true you've become a minor celebrity and whether you'll be needing an agent. The aftermath of the sale lingers for weeks. Your every action is scrutinized. If you so much as change your hair ribbon, 3 theories bloom. You're signaling secret distress, you're plotting your next move, or, most likely, you've simply lost your old ribbon and life goes on. But in the world of Victorian small-town scandal, life never really goes back to normal. You become a story, a warning, and, for the next 6 months, the answer to the question, what's the most exciting thing that's happened around here lately? So, you square your shoulders, hold your head high, and learn to live with the rumours. After all, in a world where gossip travels faster than the mail, at least you're giving them something new to talk about. Crowds come for the spectacle. Some buy chestnuts. Others just gawk. You learn quickly that nothing draws a crowd like a public marital breakdown. And yes, there are snacks. You can smell the roasted chestnuts before you even see the crowd. There's a vendor halfway between the sheep pen and the ale stall, shouting about hot nuts for a cold morning, and somehow he's selling out faster than the town ever sold out of sympathy. Around him, children dart between the legs of adults, already sticky-fingered from pilfered sweets. A trio of old men claim the best vantage point on overturned barrels, passing a bottle of something medicinal back and forth, their commentary running like the world's slowest sports broadcast. You're the main event, not the livestock, not the vegetables, not even the fiddler who occasionally gets trotted out to drown out the sound of bickering. It's you, your soon-to-be ex, and a rope that's seen better days. The whole town is here, traders, housewives, local dignitaries, and at least one person who only ever appears when there's a whiff of scandal. There's a festive energy in the air, the sort you'd expect at a May fair or a royal wedding, except instead of confetti, you get a rain of peanut shells and other people's opinions. Hecklers have come prepared. They shout suggestions, offer running critiques of the bids, and, because this is England, occasionally break into song. 2 shillings and a meat pie, and she throws in a smile. Someone yells, "You'll have to do better than that, mate. She can outbake your mother," retorts another. There's laughter, some of it good-natured, some a little sharp. You do your best to focus on the smell of cinnamon buns from the bakery stall, rather than the fact that your dignity is being auctioned off next to 3 pounds of onions. Vendors, never ones to miss an opportunity, hawk their wares with newfound enthusiasm. The fishmonger loudly proclaims that nothing says fresh start like a nice kipper. The local brewer introduces a new ale, Marital Bliss, served extra bitter. Children cluster around the candied apple stand, barely watching the proceedings, more interested in who can make the stickiest mess. But for most of the adults, the show is everything. You catch snippets of conversation as people mill around. Remember the Smith's sale last year? Now, that was a bargain. I heard she's asking for 3 pigs and a Sunday roast. Is it true he once tried to trade her for a wheelbarrow? You're tempted to start your own rumours just to see how far they'll spread. By next week, someone will claim you brought your own popcorn. There's a hierarchy among the spectators. The front row goes to those with the sharpest elbows and the juiciest gossip. The back row to the shy or faint of heart, who pretend they're only here for the honeycomb and maybe, by pure accident, witnessed a piece of local history. The baker's wife passes around pastries to keep up everyone's strength, and Agnes, yes, window-watching Agnes, is perched on a crate, distributing unsolicited opinions with every bite of her crumbling scone. Every now and then, someone tries to take charge. The local constable makes a half-hearted attempt to maintain order, but he's quickly distracted by a pie stall and the realization that nobody listens to him anyway. The vicar shakes his head in disapproval, but can't resist the promise of a warm bun and the opportunity to scold someone about family values later. By the end, the crowd is as much a part of the spectacle as the sale itself. You've been cheered, jeered, compared to a prize turnip and a stubborn mule, and offered more snacks than sympathy. As you finally step down from the platform, you realize you've survived not just the auction, but the great Victorian pastime of communal spectacle, fueled by gossip, chestnuts, and the promise of a story to tell at supper. And, as the crowd disperses, you can't help but wonder, would it all have gone better if you'd just sold tickets? Historians still argue, was the wife's sale a humiliating punishment or an ingenious workaround for women who wanted out? Either way, it's not making next year's top 10 romantic traditions. You stand on the damp cobbles, the rope at your waist, less of a restraint and more of a question mark. Are you an object, a casualty of a system rigged against you? Or are you a secret agent in crinoline, orchestrating your own escape route right under the noses of a society that thinks empowerment is a word for steam engines? Let's break it down. On the one hand, the optics are undeniably bleak. Public auction, rowdy crowd, your fate in the hands of whoever shouts the highest bid, or, in some cases, whoever isn't distracted by a sale on sausage rolls. It's not exactly the picture of liberation. The world sees you in that moment as an object, something to be traded, scrutinized, and hopefully rehomed without too many scratches. Victorian society, so proud of its morals, has constructed a situation where, to get out of a miserable marriage, you first have to survive being compared to a plough horse and a side of ham. But history, as ever, is messier than we'd like. Because here's the twist. For some women, the wife sale wasn't a punishment. It was the hack of the century. With divorce locked behind a fortress of money, lawyers, and public humiliation, the marketplace became the stage for a different kind of negotiation. If you were clever, or lucky, or just desperate enough, you could help set the terms. You might have your next husband already lined up, standing in the crowd, waiting to win you with a wink and a piglet. You could get away from a household that never suited you, from a man who snored, sneezed, or simply forgot your birthday 6 years running. All you had to do was endure a little public spectacle, no worse than a modern reality show, and with just as much questionable snack food. Of course, not every story ended with a cheerful handshake and a new address. For many women, the experience was exactly as demeaning as it looked. You could end up in a worse situation, with fewer options and more chores. The rope at your waist might as well be a shackle, and the laughter of the crowd echoes long after the market is cleared. In those moments, empowerment is the last word you'd use. Exploitation, indignity, and public embarrassment are the words that stick. But there are stories, passed down in whispers, scrawled in diaries, murmured in the pub after too much cider, of wives who played the game to their advantage. They negotiated the terms. They picked their next buyer. They turned the rules of a rigid, patriarchal society inside out and made a new life, if not with freedom, then at least with a better pillow and fewer arguments about the price of onions. Was the wife sale a victory? Not in the modern sense. You didn't win a trophy, or a congratulatory tweet, or a week in a spa. But for some, it was survival with a dash of agency, making the best of a world that offered very few choices to women who weren't wealthy, connected, or blessed with a particularly lenient vicar. So, was it empowerment or exploitation? Both. Neither. Sometimes, it was simply the only option available, packaged in the strange rituals of a society obsessed with order, and yet, somehow, endlessly inventive in its chaos. You won't find wife selling in the romance section, and it's unlikely to be the next big wedding trend. But it is a reminder that even in the most unlikely places, people find ways, however absurd, to seize a little control. Now, as you settle under your blankets and ponder Victorian problem-solving, just be grateful your worst relationship drama probably won't involve an auctioneer, a muddy street, or a stray sheep. Unless you're into that sort of thing. No judgment here. Some sales included symbolic gestures, a handkerchief or ribbon exchanged like the world's least romantic relay race. You can't make this stuff up. You'd think selling your spouse in public would be enough of a spectacle, But the Victorians, never ones to miss an opportunity for ceremony, decided to add a few extra flourishes. Perhaps it was an attempt to inject a sense of dignity, or maybe they simply loved a good prop. Either way, if you were unlucky, or lucky, enough to be part of the process, you might find yourself center stage in a pageant of improvised rituals that made even less sense the more you thought about them. Take the humble handkerchief. In a world before instant messaging, and it's not you, it's me text messages, a bit of cotton or linen took on enormous significance. Sometimes, as the final bid was accepted and the transaction declared, your soon-to-be former husband would solemnly present your new owner with a handkerchief. It might be embroidered, monogrammed, or simply whatever came out of the pocket without too much lint attached. With all the gravity of passing the Olympic torch, he'd hand it over, the crowd would hush for a moment, and just like that, you'd change hands. Legally meaningless, socially unforgettable. Other times, it was a ribbon, knotted around your wrist, then ceremonially untied and retied by your new spouse. This too was witnessed by a crowd of neighbours with strong opinions about knot tying and the latest gossip. The symbolism was unmistakable. Old ties cut, new bonds formed, and if you were lucky, a half-hearted round of applause from Mrs. Butterworth in the back, still chewing on a scone. Of course, no two sales were exactly the same. In some villages, the crowd would expect a bow, a curtsy, or even a quick spin around the marketplace, like a livestock parade, but with more judgment and fewer carrots. There were stories of sales where a loaf of bread was ceremonially broken and shared between all parties, as if carbohydrates could soak up marital disappointment. In other places, you might find yourself sipping cider with your ex and your replacement, trying to make polite conversation while the auctioneer looked on, counting his coins. At times, the rituals grew even stranger. If a particularly theatrical auctioneer was in charge, he might bang a ceremonial staff or wave an old family Bible, just for good luck. Some accounts mentioned coins placed in the bride's hand, only to be passed on like a hot potato. And if the mood was especially festive, the crowd might demand a victory lap of the marketplace, so everyone could get a good look and offer unsolicited marital advice. You had to keep your wits about you. These little acts, handkerchiefs, ribbons, bread and bows, did nothing to change your legal standing but everything to shape how the community saw you. It was performance art, Victorian style, the difference between being remembered as a troublemaker or just unlucky in love. If you were clever, you could use the rituals to send a message. A tight grip on the handkerchief. I'm not going quietly. An exaggerated bow. I'm in on the joke. A well-timed eye roll. See you at the pub later. Looking back, it's hard to say if these rituals softened the edges of a painful ordeal or just added another layer of absurdity, but they did make the events memorable. Years later, people wouldn't recall how much you were sold for, but everyone would remember the day the vicar dropped his Bible during the handoff, or when the ribbon got tangled and you had to be rescued by a very embarrassed butcher. So as you drift off, picture a foggy market, the hum of gossip, and a handkerchief floating from one hand to another. History is full of rituals, some touching, some ridiculous, all unmistakably human. And maybe, just maybe, it's those odd little gestures that make even the strangest moments worth remembering. You stand on the block, the crowd shuffles awkwardly, your husband looks nervous, even the pigs seem unimpressed. Congratulations, you're now in marital limbo. It's the sort of scene you never imagined for yourself, not even on your worst, most cabbage-filled Victorian day. You'd hoped for a swift, if undignified, resolution, a few raised hands, maybe a spirited bid, perhaps even a neighbour desperate for help with his laundry. Instead, there's only the soft shuffle of boots on mud, a cough from the fishmonger, and the bracing realization that you're not the hottest ticket at this week's market. You've reached the emotional equivalent of being picked last for the village cricket team. For a moment, you wonder if you could sweeten the deal, throw in a loaf of bread, offer your secret recipe for stew, or maybe mention that you're quite handy with a broom. But the silence hangs heavy. The auctioneer, usually so full of patter and questionable jokes, seems at a loss. He clears his throat and tries again. One wife, in good working order. Any takers? His voice wobbles, and you wonder if he's regretting that second pint of ale at lunch. Your husband, still clinging to the rope with more hope than sense, glances at the crowd and attempts a half-hearted sales pitch. She makes a mean pudding, you know, and she doesn't mind the cold. A child giggles. Someone mutters about the weather. Even Agnes, ever watchful from her window perch, is struggling to find anything juicy to report. You're left standing there, feeling less like a person and more like the day-old bread that even the ducks refuse. You shift your weight, trying not to look as desperate as you feel. It's awkward for everyone. The crowd averts their eyes, suddenly fascinated by the price of turnips. The pigs at your feet grunt in what you can only assume is solidarity. After all, they know what it's like to be appraised and ignored. It's in this excruciating limbo that the market reveals its true character. The spectators, so rowdy a moment before, fall silent. They're caught in the great British dilemma, the desire for drama, clashing with the paralyzing fear of causing a scene. No one wants to be the first to bid, but no one wants to be remembered as the person who stood by and watched a wife sale flop either. Even the auctioneer's gavel seems to hesitate, as if unsure whether to close the sale or just quietly slink away. This is where the real negotiations begin. Maybe a friend steps forward, just to break the tension, offering a single shilling or a slightly bruised apple. Maybe the auctioneer suggests a group discount. Take her and the goat for a special price. Occasionally, the solution is as simple as calling it off altogether, declaring it a dry day for the market, and everyone dispersing, eager to talk about anything but what just happened. For you, the aftermath is a strange cocktail of relief and embarrassment. The sale didn't go through, but neither did your exit strategy. You're stuck, married but not quite, single but not really. There's always next week, your husband mutters, as if you're a sack of potatoes waiting for a better offer. As you slink away from the block, you're reminded that Victorian life is nothing if not unpredictable. Sometimes you're the star attraction, sometimes you're just background scenery in someone else's scandal. Either way, you learn to carry yourself with a certain dignity, even when the pigs are the only ones paying attention. So, if you ever find yourself unsold at the marriage market, remember, it's not you, it's them, or possibly the weather. Or maybe everyone's just waiting to see if the butcher will throw in a sausage. In the end, limbo is still better than being haggled over like a second-hand umbrella. And tomorrow, at least, you won't have to move your things. Sometimes, a wife sale ended with a transfer to a new partner, someone you'd already been courting in secret. Love in Victorian England. It's complicated. The market square is bustling with the usual chaos. Vendors hawking turnips, children darting through the mud, and a dog barking at its own reflection in a puddle. But for you, today isn't about produce or poultry. It's about new beginnings, Victorian style. Because behind the public spectacle of ropes and bids, there's often another story quietly unfurling, a story that would never make the official town records, but everyone in the alehouse already knows by heart. You see, not every wife sale is the result of a catastrophic falling out or marital misery. Sometimes, it's just a matter of logistics. Two people trapped in the wrong stories, quietly plotting their own rewrite. You and your buyer have been exchanging glances for months over the bread stall. A smile here, a borrowed egg there, and maybe a wink when your husband isn't looking. Courtship is tricky when the entire village is watching, but necessity is the mother of invention, and the local gossip grapevine is surprisingly easy to use if you know the right code words. The rhubarb looks very fresh this year, being the Victorian equivalent of "let's run away together." On the big day, the crowd gathers expecting drama and scandal, maybe even a stray chicken chase, but what they get is something more like a handoff in a well-rehearsed play. The auctioneer launches into his usual patter, but you're already watching your intended, who stands near the back, clutching a ribbon or a small token, ready to bid. Your soon-to-be former husband puts on a decent show of sighing and shrugging, but even he knows this is the best outcome for everyone. After all, he's got his eye on the neighbour's widowed sister, who makes a potato pie so good it's practically a religious experience. Bidding begins. The crowd's enthusiasm is polite but subdued. They suspect what's going on, but it's more fun to speculate over chestnuts later. Your admirer offers a fair price, 2 shillings, a bag of apples, and the promise to fix the leaky roof. And the auctioneer nods approvingly. Even Agnes, glued to her window, can't find anything to complain about, except perhaps the lack of a proper scandal. Once the sale is done, the handoff is almost theatrical. Maybe there's a quick exchange of smiles, or the discreet passing of a ribbon. Your new partner takes the rope. Not too tight, not too loose, and leads you gently through the market, past the fishmonger, and the children still playing at being auctioneers themselves. The sense of relief is palpable. You're free from a marriage that fizzled out before last winter, and now you're stepping, carefully, mind the mud, into a future you actually chose. Not all love stories are grand declarations or moonlit serenades. Sometimes they're practical arrangements. A widow needs a good roof. A baker needs someone who won't burn the bread. A tired woman needs a partner who actually listens when she talks about the price of coal. The market isn't exactly Paris in the springtime, but it's a place where second chances are negotiated next to the radishes. And what of your old spouse? In the best-case scenario, he's just as relieved as you are, off to court that pie-making neighbour or finally take up residence in the vicarage, where he can complain about turnips without anyone interrupting. In the worst case, well, at least he gets a quiet house and one less person criticising his sock-mending skills. So, yes, love in Victorian England is complicated. It's not always about passion or poetry. Sometimes it's about fresh starts, mutual agreements, and the quiet satisfaction of choosing who you'd like to share your bread and your complaints about the weather with. In a world where options are limited, recycling a spouse is just another way to make do, and maybe, just maybe, find a little happiness along the way. Occasionally someone gets arrested. It's never the person you expect. The judge is just relieved you didn't sell the family cow by mistake. For all the chaos and confusion of a Victorian wife sale, every now and then the law actually stirs from its long afternoon nap. Technically, wife selling is not just frowned upon, it's completely, absolutely, 100% illegal. You can't sell your spouse any more than you can sell the church steeple or the mayor's hat. Although, to be fair, there are rumours about both after the harvest festival got out of hand last year. But illegal in Victorian England is a bit like optional at a family dinner. It depends on who's watching, how much paperwork is involved, and whether the local magistrate is feeling energetic. It usually starts when someone, maybe a well-meaning neighbour, maybe a local vicar, maybe just someone annoyed they didn't get first pick at the auction, decides that the whole business has gone a little too far. A constable, summoned from his vital duties of napping and sampling pies at the market, wades in, his truncheon out and his hat slightly askew. There's a lot of tut-tutting, a stern reading of the law, and then the slow shuffle toward the village courthouse. Here's where things get complicated. Who gets arrested? The husband for selling his wife? The buyer for making a mockery of marriage? The auctioneer for running an unlicensed sideline in matrimony? On one memorable occasion, a goat was taken into custody, just for standing too close to the action and looking suspiciously complicit. More often than not, though, it's the unlucky soul who made the most noise, drew the biggest crowd, or failed to bribe the right official with a fruitcake at Christmas. Once you're in the courtroom, an experience that makes the market seem positively relaxing, the confusion multiplies. The judge, a man with a moustache so droopy it should have its own seat, sighs and flips through his law books. He's faced with a case that isn't technically written down anywhere, but everyone knows is just not the done thing. The prosecutor makes a half-hearted case about the sanctity of marriage. The defense tries to explain that really, this was all just a misunderstanding, and absolutely no one intended to cause a scandal. The jury, chosen for their ability to stay awake and not snore too loudly, listens intently, except for the butcher, who uses the time to write his shopping list. The verdict? It's anyone's guess. Sometimes, the offender is let off with a warning and a stern talking to about keeping up appearances. Sometimes, there's a small fine, usually just enough to cover the price of the judge's next lunch. On rare occasions, the whole village is invited to the next church service, where the vicar delivers a fiery sermon about the sanctity of the home while side-eyeing everyone in the first 3 pews. And then there are the consequences nobody plans for. The newspaper, always eager for a story, runs a dramatic headline: "Scandal at Market. Wife auction ends in arrest." Your cousin in Liverpool sends a panicked letter. Children ask awkward questions at the dinner table. The price of eggs inexplicably rises. By the time the dust settles, you're either a minor celebrity or a cautionary tale, or both. In the end, the law is less about rules and more about spectacle, paperwork, and making sure no one accidentally auctions off the mayor's wife instead of his own. Most villagers go back to their routines, trading stories, bread, and the occasional sideways glance. You, meanwhile, are just grateful that, this time, it wasn't your turn in the dock, or that, at the very least, your cow is safe. So, next time you're at the market and someone starts tying a rope, remember the law is watching. Sort of. Occasionally. Unless there's pie, what happens to the kids, or the dog, or the mother-in-law nobody wanted? Sometimes, the family is split up like a poorly organised raffle. Let's be honest. Victorian wife sales were rarely just about 2 people. If only it were that simple. You stand on the auction block, squinting into the crowd, while your offspring hover nearby, arms crossed, eyes wide, each silently calculating where they might end up by tea time. The dog, for his part, is enthusiastically chewing a bit of rope, possibly the very rope meant for your ceremonial handoff. As for your mother-in-law, she's already in the thick of the crowd, loudly reminding anyone within earshot that in her day, people just stuck things out until the end, or, failing that, moved to Wales. Children are the real wildcards of the Victorian family shuffle. Sometimes they're claimed as extras, like side dishes you didn't actually order, but which appear on the bill anyway. The auctioneer, ever the showman, might call out, "Comes with 2 strong lads, good at mucking out the stable." If you're lucky, your next home is with someone who doesn't mind a house full of muddy boots, or who genuinely appreciates a child who can recite half the Book of Psalms before breakfast. But there's little consistency in these domestic negotiations. Some sales are ruthlessly practical. You, the wife, go one way. The eldest boy, who can already swing a hammer, is snapped up by a local blacksmith. The younger children, too small for useful labour but excellent at eating bread, may be left with your former husband or pawned off to the nearest relative willing to accept a bribe or a particularly fresh loaf. As for the family cat, nobody ever really remembers to decide, and it simply follows the gravy. Pets fare better or worse depending on the bidder. Dogs, at least, usually go where the children do. Cats, being cats, go wherever and whenever they like. Sale or no sale. Chickens, surprisingly, are sometimes the only ones who get an upgrade. They're useful, non-judgmental, and never ask for pocket money. And then there's the extended family, cousins, grandparents, that uncle who still hasn't paid back the bread money from last Christmas. The mother-in-law, resolutely unimpressed by the entire proceedings, often lingers in the background, arms folded and opinions ready. Sometimes she'll declare her loyalty and go with you. Sometimes she plants herself firmly in the old home, a fixture as permanent as the fireplace, scowling at anyone who dares rearrange her chair. Splitting up the family can be surprisingly bureaucratic. In rare cases, a written agreement is drafted, a sort of proto-custody arrangement jotted down on the back of an ale receipt. Eldest child to remain with mother, dog to accompany youngest, no visits from Uncle Reg on Sundays. These deals are hardly enforceable, but they provide a comforting illusion of order in a world where order is mostly optional. The village, of course, has opinions about every possible arrangement. Agnes, ever alert at her window, is already passing judgment, predicting which child will thrive and which dog will eat the best scraps. The vicar offers gentle sermons about the importance of family, conveniently skipping over the awkward bit where half the parish now has shared custody of a goat. In the end, the dust settles. Some families stay mostly intact, forging new lives with only minor changes in seating arrangements at supper. Others are scattered across town, united by nothing more than shared stories and a mutual dislike of cold porridge. The dog, unfazed, finds the nearest hearth. The children squabble, play, and, before long, make new alliances. So, when the final rope is untied and the last bun is eaten, remember, in the Victorian family raffle you rarely get to choose your prize, but you can always hope you end up somewhere with a warm fire, friendly faces, and a pet that remembers your name. There's a reason most wife sales happened near pubs. Ale makes everything seem like a good idea. Until the next morning, when you realize your new husband snores even louder. The scent of hops and hope lingers over the village market, thick as fog on a November morning. You're ushered toward the auction block, the rope at your waist barely outshining the flush on your cheeks. The crowd, already warmed by a mug or two, is in high spirits. Laughter mingles with the clink of tankards, and the local brewer is doing a brisk trade. After all, nothing fuels questionable decision-making quite like half a pint and a front-row seat to marital mayhem. Ale is, unofficially, the great social lubricant of Victorian England. It makes the bravest bidders braver, the hecklers louder, and the auctioneer's jokes just funny enough to get a polite titter, even if you're being compared to last week's mutton. Your soon-to-be ex is perhaps on his second or third mug, gesticulating grandly about your many virtues. And, if he's smart, leaving out your propensity to hide the best bread or claim migraine during tax season. You stand there, listening to the spirited arguments. One man claims he can tell the worth of a woman by the way she holds her ale. Another insists you'd make a fine addition to his household, especially if you bring your famous rhubarb tart and don't mind his singing. Occasionally, someone tries to start a bidding war, but it fizzles when the innkeeper shouts that he's running a special on pickled eggs. It's all fun and games, at least until the last song is sung, the last mug drained, and the crowd starts to wander home, weaving slightly from left to right. This is the moment when reality sets in. The new husband, who seemed so dashing under the lantern light, is revealed to be a world-class snorer with a collection of suspiciously ugly hats and an undying loyalty to his mother's shepherd's pie. The kitchen, seen through the haze of a good buzz, is a cold, unfamiliar territory. The fresh start suddenly feels less like a romantic adventure and more like waking up on someone else's floor after a poorly planned sleepover. You're not alone in your regret. The ex-husband, triumphant at first, soon discovers the joy of single life is vastly overrated, especially when it comes with all the laundry. The auctioneer, still counting his coins, starts to wonder if he should have just stuck to sheep, and the local pub owner, clearing up the last of the tankards, is already anticipating next week's drama. After all, nothing sells more ale than the promise of a good story. The next morning dawns with all the charm of a headache and a half. The market square is quiet, the echoes of laughter and shouts replaced by the cawing of crows and the distant sound of the baker kneading dough. You awake in your new home, staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly was in that last mug of ale. The answer, as always, is more than you thought. Breakfast is a stilted affair. New routines negotiated over tepid tea and a mountain of awkwardness. The conversation is cautious. Did you sleep well? No. Do you like dogs? Depends on the dog. Should we give it a week, or just move straight to polite nodding in the street? The regrets are as thick as the porridge, but there's comfort in routine, even if it's a routine you never meant to sign up for. By noon you find yourself at the pub, seeking both a cure and a sympathetic ear. The bartender offers wisdom, and a hangover remedy of questionable origin. You nod along as he says, "At least you weren't traded for a turnip and half a song. That's how I met my second wife." So, as the sun sets and the stories spread, you can't help but laugh, just a little. In Victorian England, every mistake is a new beginning, especially if it starts and ends with ale. And next time, you promise yourself, you'll bid with a clear head, or at least for someone who doesn't snore. Sometimes, it wasn't just about escaping a bad match. It was about clearing debts, settling scores, or paying the rent. You too can be listed as slightly used, minor scuff marks. In the Victorian world, love might make the world go round, but unpaid bills make it grind to a halt. Sometimes you find yourself not only part of a marriage, but also part of a complicated financial transaction. A sort of 2-for-1 deal at the least romantic department store in history. Your spouse, hunched over the kitchen table with a pile of IOUs and a furrowed brow, finally looks up and sees a solution. Sell the wife, clear the slate, and hope the new owner throws in a meat pie as a signing bonus. The signs have been there for a while. The landlord's been circling the house with the slow determination of a vulture. The baker, who used to hand you an extra crust, now just glances at your boots and sighs. The coal merchant has started sending friendly reminders written in handwriting so sharp you could cut cheese with it. And so, when all other options have run out, no more chickens to pawn, no friendly aunt with a mysterious inheritance, your husband begins to view matrimony less as a sacred bond and more as a negotiable asset. It's not exactly the stuff of romance novels. There's no moonlit proposal, no whispered promises. Instead, there's a stack of bills, a half-empty cupboard, and the kind of tension that makes the cat hide under the bed for a week. You try not to take it personally. After all, in a world where women can't own property, sign a contract, or claim their own wages, sometimes being listed as lightly worn, some fading is the only way to keep the family afloat. Market day arrives. You step out onto the cobblestones, past the creditors loitering like seagulls, and into the clamour of commerce. The auctioneer, well-versed in all things transactional, announces 1 wife for sale, excellent condition, loyal service, debt attached, negotiable. The crowd perks up. Nothing gets Victorian England's attention like a good deal, especially when it comes bundled with a family heirloom or the promise of a debt forgiven. Bidding is less about personality and more about payment plans. Someone shouts, "I'll take her if she brings the pie dish." Another yells, "Will you throw in the dog?" The terms are openly discussed. Debts subtracted from the bid, a few coppers for the washing tub, maybe a year's rent settled if the buyer agrees to take your mother-in-law off everyone's hands. You're not sure whether to laugh, cry, or offer a special on Thursday night stews. Sometimes, the outcome is unexpectedly pragmatic. You might end up with a new husband who actually reads the bills before tossing them in the fire. Or perhaps you land in a house where the only debt is to the cat, who expects dinner on time and scratches the furniture in protest. Other times, you swap one creditor for another, new home, new debts, same old arguments about the price of eggs. The original husband, now debt-free and somewhat dazed, spends the next few weeks explaining his choices to anyone who will listen. He claims it was for the good of the family. You suspect it was for the good of his sleep schedule. The town, ever resourceful, adapts one family in the clear, another set of hands for the wash, and enough gossip to fuel the next 3 market days. At the end of it all, you find yourself still slightly used, still with minor scuff marks, but with debts cleared and, if luck is with you, a better bed. Capitalism in Victorian England is nothing if not creative. And as you drift off to sleep, you can't help but marvel. In a world where everything has a price, even a fresh start might just be for sale. Terms and conditions, of course, apply. After the sale, life goes on. Sort of. Maybe you end up with someone kinder. Maybe you're back in the market next week. At least it's never boring. you step off the auction block and onto unfamiliar ground. The crowd that cheered, heckled, and nibbled chestnuts at your marital fate is already drifting away. Some to the alehouse, some to their homes, all with fresh gossip for the supper table. Your new husband, who may or may not have won you with the promise of a pie dish and 2 shillings, stands beside you looking as nervous as you feel. There's a pause, awkward and heavy, as if you're both waiting for someone to hand out scripts for the next act. The walk to your new home is, well, it's something. Maybe you clutch a small bag of possessions, your best shawl, and a secret hope that the mattress here is less lumpy than the last. Your new spouse tries to make conversation. Do you prefer tea or coffee? Do you mind dogs? Any strong opinions about turnips? And you answer with the reserved optimism of someone who's already survived being appraised by a dozen neighbours and a sheep. Inside, you face the great unknown. New hearth, new rules, new faces at the table. Some transitions are gentle. Your new partner is kind, maybe even bashful. They clear a place for your things, offer you the good mug, and let you choose the spot by the fire. In the best cases, you both settle into a tentative truce, building a new routine around porridge, shared chores, and mutual bewilderment. The first days are a cautious dance. Who stokes the fire? Who decides when to sweep? How do you agree on the best way to fold the napkins? Other times, the adjustment is less smooth. Maybe your new husband turns out to be just as stubborn as the last, only now he snores in a different key. Maybe his mother lives with him, and she's made it clear that no one can make bread like my Sarah. You try, anyway. You're nothing if not persistent. You find yourself learning the rhythms of a household you didn't choose, making mental notes about the quirks. Never put your feet on that stool. Always check the stew for surprises. And don't let the dog near your knitting. Meanwhile, the town has already moved on to the next drama. Someone's lost a pig, someone else is rumoured to be selling their best boots, and the market square is abuzz with speculation about whether next week will bring a sale more scandalous than yours. Agnes, the neighbourhood's chief gossip and self-appointed historian, is spreading news of your brave face and sensible shoes, while the vicar offers up prayers for your new household and quietly hopes for less paperwork. But sometimes, new beginnings are short-lived. Maybe you and your new spouse simply can't get along, or maybe you both realise the arrangement was a mistake made under pressure, too much ale, or the hopeful promise of better stew. In that case, the cycle can repeat. Back to the market you go, with slightly more experience, a better poker face, and the lingering hope that the third time's the charm. Still, even when the outcome is uncertain, there's a sense of resilience that threads through it all. You adapt, you adjust, and you make the best of things. Because in Victorian England, making the best of things is practically a full-time job. Every ending, even one on an auction block, is just the beginning of another story. So you tuck into your new bed, stare up at the unfamiliar ceiling, and wonder what tomorrow will bring. Maybe it's peace and quiet. Maybe it's a goat in the kitchen. At least for now, you're not boring. And sometimes, in the long and muddled game of history, that's the very best you can hope for. The church, unsurprisingly, is not amused. Your local vicar tries to stop the sale by ringing bells, waving Bibles, and occasionally fainting from shock. To the Victorian mind, if there's anything worse than public scandal, it's public scandal within earshot of the parish church. You can't really blame the vicar. He spends his days preaching about the sanctity of marriage, the importance of family, and why God probably doesn't appreciate being woken up by the sound of auctioneers. And yet, here you are, right on his doorstep, with half the congregation elbowing each other for a better view of the latest marital transaction. It's enough to make even the holiest of men reach for the communion wine a little early. The day of the sale, the church bells go off at a suspiciously dramatic moment, echoing across the market square. It's less a call to worship and more a frantic attempt at divine intervention. an oral reminder that some things, at least, are supposed to be sacred. The vicar, in full ceremonial regalia and a cloud of nervous energy, charges into the crowd, Bible in hand, determined to halt proceedings before anyone can utter the words going, gone. He launches into a sermon delivered at a volume usually reserved for emergencies, local fires, or unexpected visits from the bishop. Marriage is a sacred covenant, he bellows, conveniently ignoring the fact that Mrs. Jenkins, in the second pew every Sunday, once tried to auction off her own husband for a barrel of cider. This is not the will of the Almighty. The crowd, however, is equal parts entertained and confused. Some murmur agreement. Others whisper about whether the vicar has ever actually been married himself. And one child tries to see how many chestnuts it takes to distract a man of the cloth. If dramatic speeches don't work, there's always good old-fashioned fainting. Victorian vicars are champions at swooning just when things get interesting. It's the ultimate protest. Nothing says I object like collapsing gracefully onto the cobblestones, forcing the choir boys to run for help and the nearest widow to produce a bottle of smelling salts. Or, if those run out, last week's leftover pickled onions. Sometimes the feint is genuine, nerves, indignation, or a combination of both. Other times, you can spot the practiced flutter of eyelids and the strategic collapse that just happens to disrupt bidding at a crucial moment. Despite all the drama, the church rarely succeeds in stopping the sale. The law, wobbly as it is, tends to look the other way, and the townsfolk have learned to politely ignore thunderous sermons if there's a bargain at stake. The vicar, defeated but undeterred, resorts to other tactics. Awkward visits to your new home, long lectures about the value of forgiveness, and carefully crafted prayers for the restoration of virtue to this troubled parish. Behind the scenes, church ladies form crisis committees, gathering over weak tea to debate your fate. Should they invite you back to choir? Is your marriage valid in the eyes of God, or just in the ledger at the market? And who exactly gets to keep the family pew? You become the subject of Sunday school lessons. Remember, children, don't sell your spouse, even for a shiny new goat, and occasional charity drives for the redemption of souls and maybe some better curtains. Still, life goes on. The church bells ring, the vicar preaches, and you sit in your new pew, head held high, listening to the same old hymns, knowing your story will be retold long after the last crumb of communion bread is gone. So, as you drift towards sleep, remember, even in a world obsessed with rules and rituals, there's always someone ringing a bell, waving a Bible, or fainting in protest. And somehow, despite it all, people find a way forward, sometimes with a new husband, sometimes with a sheepish smile, but always with a story for the ages. A few stories become local legend. Remember when Farmer Jenkins tried to sell his wife and the goat ran off with the proceeds? The stuff of pub tales for decades. Victorian England was no stranger to the absurd, but nothing got retold in greater detail or greater exaggeration than a truly memorable wife sale. While most were small, muddy affairs, soon forgotten by everyone except the unlucky couple, every village had that one sale, the one that made history, fueled generations of gossip, and inspired 3 different versions at the local pub. Take the legendary case of Farmer Jenkins. He was a man known for his optimism, his questionable arithmetic, and his habit of keeping goats far too close to the dinner table. When the day came to part ways with Mrs. Jenkins, the whole village gathered. The stakes were high, the crowd hungry for drama, and the pub already placing bets on how much she'd fetch. Would it be more or less than the big sack of potatoes from the year before? The auction began with the usual banter, a few half-hearted bids, and Jenkins trying to sweeten the deal by throwing in a goat described as mostly house-trained. The bids climbed, the goat watched suspiciously, and just as Jenkins handed over the proceeds, a small pouch of coins and a note for 1 week's ale, the goat, clearly unimpressed, snatched the pouch in its teeth and bolted. For years, Locals swore they saw it lurking at the market, buying cabbages and keeping secrets. The story was told so many times that even the vicar once gave a sermon about guarding your treasures from temptation and livestock. Other famous sales took on lives of their own. In one town, a wife insisted on auctioning herself just to prove a point and ended up selling for a record price, 5 shillings, 3 meat pies, and a promise to sweep the church steps every Sunday. The buyer, perhaps the town's most eligible bachelor, meaning he owned his own boots, later confessed he'd been outbid only because his mother kept distracting him with questions about the quality of homemade jam. Another tale tells of the double sale, a day when 2 couples, each fed up with their own marriages, decided to swap partners directly. The entire affair was done with an air of solemnity that left even the sternest magistrate speechless. The newlyweds, if that's the word, hosted a celebratory tea party that quickly devolved into the only known instance of a scone fight ever recorded in the county records. Some stories were cautionary tales, repeated by anxious mothers as warnings to wayward daughters. "Don't you end up like Mrs. Payne's Hargrove," they'd whisper, "sold for half a pound of cheese and a broken umbrella, then forced to live above the fishmonger." Others had happy endings, love matches sealed by the luck of the gavel, with the newly joined couple living together for years and only occasionally arguing about who got the better deal. Of course, the best part of these famous wife sales wasn't just the story, it was the embellishments added over time. Each retelling added new details: a dramatic feint, an argument over change, a bid from a mysterious stranger who may or may not have been a foreign prince in disguise. By the time the tale reached the next generation, the goat was rumoured to have started a business, and the auctioneer was famous for wearing a hat that doubled as a soup tureen. History only remembers the outrageous, the memorable, and the slightly unhinged. In the end, it's these tales, part truth, part entertainment, all deeply human, that survive. So, as you settle in and listen to the rain, imagine the laughter in the pub, the clang of the auctioneer's spoon, and the unlikely heroes of history: a woman with grit, a man with poor judgment, and always a goat with a taste for mischief. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes the strangest stories make the best legends. The truth is always stranger than fiction. Did some women use the sale as a path to freedom? Did some husbands ever buy their wives back just to avoid cooking? Victorian England thrived on tales that wove the line between possible and patently absurd. The truth about wife-selling lies somewhere in that foggy borderland, shaped by fact, rumour, and the village's need for a story that's even juicier than the butcher's best sausage. Ask any crowd, and you'll hear the classics. The resourceful wife, who accidentally fetched a record price, then used her newfound freedom to start a bakery, and the poor husband who, after sampling his own stew for 3 days straight, showed up at market with his hat in hand, ready to bid his spouse back, no questions asked. These stories travel fast, gathering embellishments and odd details like a snowball rolling through a field of loose laundry. The myth-making begins the moment the auctioneer's gavel falls. Sometimes it's a whisper. "Did you hear Mrs. Caldwell smiled as she left?" Sometimes it's full-blown legend. They say old man Frobisher tried to sell his wife 3 times, but the dog kept biting the rope. If enough people repeat it, it might as well be gospel, and by the time it reaches the next village, the wife is rumoured to have escaped by hiding in a flour barrel and the husband has joined the circus. But behind every outlandish tale, there's often a kernel of real, if uncomfortable, truth. For some women, wife-selling wasn't simply a humiliation. It was a rare, risky loophole to break free from a marriage gone cold. Legally, they had almost no options. But if the sale was mutual, and the new buyer was more than just a stranger, perhaps a lover, perhaps a kind neighbour, then the ordeal might lead to an actual new beginning. The rope, the bidding, the exchange of handkerchiefs, it was all a public act, but for some it was the only exit available, even if it meant being the talk of the village for years. Of course, there were cases where regret set in almost immediately. More than one husband, haunted by burnt porridge and a chorus of lonely socks, came back to the market, looking sheepish. Bidding to buy back a wife was embarrassing, sure, but less so than facing his own cooking every day or explaining to the children why the laundry now smelled like cabbage. Urban legends have a way of sprouting up wherever there's a gap in the record books. One tale tells of a wife who, upon realizing her husband was outbidding all the competition, declared the auction void on account of foolishness and went home with the dog instead. Another features a sale that ended with both parties running off together, pockets full of the auction proceeds, and a vow never to do laundry again. Some tales are warnings. Don't laugh too hard at the sale. Next time, it could be you, say the grandmothers, wagging a finger over the teacups. Others are wistful, suggesting that, at least in some cases, a public spectacle led to a private happiness, strange as that may sound. The reality of wife-selling is of course tangled. Most cases were born out of desperation, poverty, and the lack of legal rights for women. It was rarely a fairy tale, often humiliating, and always fodder for the town's best storytellers. But if the legends are to be believed, every now and then, someone managed to slip through the cracks of expectation and write their own strange ending. So, as you drift off, imagine a world where myths and reality dance side by side, where truth is stranger than fiction, and where the wildest stories in the pub might, just might, have a grain of truth hiding at the bottom of the ale mug. London, York, and rural Dorset all had their own spin on the tradition. In some places, it was practically a village festival, minus the fun. Every corner of England seemed to add its own peculiar flavour to the already odd institution of wife-selling. In bustling London, the process played out in the shadow of grandeur and grime, the crowd thick with merchants, curious onlookers, and the ever-present pickpocket hoping for a little extra luck. Here, a sale could happen in the shadow of Smithfield Market, right between a pen of sheep and the city's finest eels. One moment you're buying a turnip, the next you're witnessing someone try to auction off their spouse for the price of a half-pint and a second-hand umbrella. Londoners, masters of the deadpan, barely blinked. In a city where scandals were as common as fog, the wife sale was just another sideshow. Up north in York, where the stone walls kept out everything except the chill and the gossip, things were more ceremonial. Word would travel ahead of the event, and by the time the big day arrived, the whole city seemed to be in on it. Town criers made the announcement, stallholders brought out their best produce, and the local innkeeper had a special on Liberation Ale. There might even be a parade. Nothing says new beginnings like a marching band playing a slightly off-key version of Greensleeves as you're led to the auction block. The townsfolk took their entertainment seriously, and stories from these northern markets lingered long after the last shilling changed hands. Rural Dorset, meanwhile, gave the practice its own rustic twist. Here, the market was less grand, more muddy boots and mossy stone, with geese honking judgment as you made your way through the crowd. The event had all the excitement of a harvest festival, minus the dancing and plus a fair amount of side-eye. Local bakers hawked nervous scones, children played auction with dolls and chickens, and the village matriarchs stood in tight-knit circles, arms folded, lips pursed. No one ever admitted to attending, of course, but everyone somehow knew exactly how it went. It was a quiet affair, they'd whisper. But did you hear about the bid involving 3 turnips and a wedding cake? Even the rituals varied. In Yorkshire, the handkerchief handoff might be accompanied by a ceremonial pint. In parts of Cornwall, the tradition was to throw a small celebration at the nearest tavern, provided nobody fainted during the proceedings. Some towns tried to keep things dignified, with the vicar giving a half-hearted blessing and everyone pretending it was a sombre affair. Others embraced the chaos, letting the sale blend into the normal business of the day, right between the shouting fishmonger and the giggling children. But whether city or countryside, the underlying theme was always the same: finding a way out when there were no easy options, making do with the tools at hand, and giving the neighbours something to talk about. Some sales ended with handshakes, others with arguments, and a few with outright fistfights over who got the best teapot in the deal. By sundown, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Bidders collected their new spouses, villagers swapped stories over ale and stew, and the market square was swept clean, at least until the next round of trading. The wife sale faded into rumour, becoming another thread in the patchwork of local history. In the morning, a new day began, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. So, as you settle in for the night, picture markets from London to Dorset, muddy, loud, and teeming with life. Places where the extraordinary became ordinary, and every strange tradition had its place. It wasn't always fun, but it was never, ever dull. Eventually, the lawyers show up. Public auctions become less frequent. Divorce becomes a bit more accessible, though never less awkward. Change in Victorian England always arrived with a certain amount of huffing, puffing, and paperwork. For decades, the local market had been the place to trade everything from onions to, well, unwanted spouses. But, as the 19th century trundled on and the long arm of the law began to reach even the muddiest village square, it was clear that the days of wife-selling were numbered. At first, no one quite believed it. Old Mrs. Greaves, who had witnessed 3 sales and once nearly bid on her own husband out of spite, swore that no lawyer alive could stop a good market tradition. But lawyers, it turns out, are like cold drafts in a stone cottage. They sneak in whether you want them or not. Soon, the clink of coins and the auctioneer's cry were competing with the rustle of legal documents and the stern glare of men in stiff collars. The process of divorce, once so expensive and exclusive it might as well have been a royal privilege, began to loosen up. Parliament, prodded by reformers and the occasional scandal involving a nobleman's 5th cousin, passed laws that allowed ordinary folks to untangle their marital knots without needing to sell anyone beside the turnip cart. You could now pay a lawyer, and, if you were lucky, not your life savings, to argue your case. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but at least it didn't involve rope, handkerchiefs, or an audience of nosy neighbours and slightly tipsy butchers. Naturally, the market crowds were disappointed. No more spectacle, no more gossip-worthy sales, no more excuses to gather for chestnuts and cider while watching Mrs. Butterworth insist on being sold only to someone who liked cats. Instead, everything moved behind closed doors into offices that smelled of ink and impatience. There were still arguments, of course, and the occasional attempt to barter an unwanted spouse for a new tea set. But these became the stuff of private drama, not public entertainment. The vicar, for one, heaved a sigh of relief. No more surprise sermons or fainting spells required. The constable found himself with less to do and far fewer pies to sample for crowd control purposes. Even Agnes, ever watchful from her lace-curtained window, admitted that divorce, while dreadfully modern, at least meant she could finally eat her scones in peace. But for many, the decline of the wife sale was bittersweet. It meant less scandal and shame, but also less room for oddball improvisation. The old loophole was closed. Now, if you wanted out of a bad marriage, you had to navigate forms, fees, and the ever-present risk of seeing your business in the local paper under court reports rather than market news. Divorce itself was still a gamble, awkward, public in its own way, and rarely simple. Of course, some clung to tradition. Rumours spread of a secret sale here or there. A rope passed quietly behind the stables, a handkerchief exchanged with only the moon as witness. But these were the last gasps of a fading custom, destined to join the ranks of other oddities like eel pies and maypole disputes. In the end, the lawyers had their way, and the marriage market faded into history, leaving behind only stories, legends, and the occasional bewildered goat. The world moved on. Love, loss, and the longing for a better deal continued, just with more paperwork and fewer public snacks. So as you fall asleep, spare a thought for the end of an era, a time when you could solve your problems in the open air, with a crowd, a cask of cider, and maybe a new start, if you could find the right bidder. And if your lawyer ever seems slow or your divorce drags on, Just be grateful you're not standing on a market block listening for bids, and that you never had to haggle over your own handkerchief. You made it through, sort of. Now the question is, would you survive a day in Victorian marital limbo? Or would you just offer yourself as a slightly used footstool and hope for the best? Let's be honest, you've been through the ringer. You've endured the awkward silence of the auction block, the pointed whispers of Agnes at her window, and the not-so-subtle bartering of your best shawl for an upgrade in the bedding department. Victorian marriage auctions weren't for the faint-hearted or the easily embarrassed. So, how would you fare? Dropped into this dizzying swirl of rope, roast chestnuts, and public negotiation. First, there's the matter of crowd control. Could you handle the hecklers? The town square isn't just a backdrop, it's an arena, filled with people who never learned the difference between private thoughts and public announcements. She snores, but she makes a mean pie. Yells someone you've never met. Could you keep your chin up as the bids roll in, fluctuating between a decent shilling and a gently used pair of boots? Let's not forget the snacks. Could you enjoy your roasted chestnuts while being described as an excellent turnip peeler with only moderate opinions on soup? Would you politely decline the marital bliss ale or go for a second round to steady your nerves? Negotiation is its own art form. You might try to nudge the bidding higher, after all, if you're going to be publicly appraised. You'd like to at least fetch more than the price of a goose. Would you wink at a friend in the crowd to up the ante? Drop a well-timed hint about your bread-baking prowess? Or would you, like some, simply stand there and hope to be swept away by someone who knows the value of a solid Wednesday stew? Then there's the social tightrope. All those sideways glances, muttered judgments, and the looming possibility of being the week's main attraction in the local paper. Would you be a scandal, a legend, or just a cautionary tale for next year's crop of unlucky romantics? And if, by some twist of fate, no one bid, would you slink off the block with dignity intact, or would you offer to throw in the family cat and see if that sweetens the deal? Spoiler: the cat probably has its own agenda and is not up for auction. After the dust settles, you'd have to start again. New home, new rules, and, with any luck, a new mattress that doesn't poke you in the back every time you roll over. Would you master the art of the polite breakfast conversation? Yes, I do like dogs. No, I don't eat onions before noon. Or would you simply opt for quiet resignation and a very large mug of tea? Maybe, just maybe, you'd find yourself embracing the chaos. Perhaps you'd make friends with the other auction alumni, swapping stories over market day snacks and forming a kind of unofficial club. Survivors of the Rope and Gavel Society. Secret handshakes optional, gossip guaranteed. The truth is, few people escaped the Victorian marriage market unchanged. It took grit, wit, and the ability to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Could you have survived? Almost certainly, if you could face down a crowd, keep your sense of humour, and make peace with the fact that, sometimes, life really does come down to who can shout the loudest over the price of a cabbage. So, as you drift off tonight, give yourself some credit. You've navigated the madness, the mayhem, and the marriage mart. And in a world full of slightly used footstools, you've learned that a little resilience, and maybe a handful of chestnuts, can go a long, long way. Sometimes, a sale wasn't official until a contract was scrawled on the back of a pub bill or a handy cabbage leaf. The terms? Usually something like, one wife, no refunds, includes apron. You're handed a crumbly sheet by a grinning auctioneer, and just like that, you're legally someone else's problem, at least until the ink smudges in the rain. Welcome to the world of Victorian market paperwork, where the rules are made up, the signatures barely legible, and the only thing standing between you and freedom, or your next round of marital limbo, is a piece of paper with suspicious gravy stains. You'd think, after all the drama of the auction block, that the process would end with a grand pronouncement, or at least a handshake. But no. Here comes the contract, a document less legally binding than a promise made during a thunderstorm. You, standing in the drizzle with your best bonnet slowly wilting, peer down at the so-called contract. The auctioneer, flushed with success and probably half a pint of ale, waves his pen with a flourish. He's had years to perfect his handwriting, shaky, looping, and with just enough flair to impress Mrs. Butterworth, who once declared herself a connoisseur of fine signatures. The terms are flexible to say the least. Some contracts read like a wish list. Must enjoy stews, tolerate mother-in-law, and promise not to burn the sheets more than twice a season. Others are more practical, includes 2 children, 1 goat, and a fine collection of mismatched spoons. Occasionally you see a cheeky note at the bottom. No refunds, no returns. Buyer assumes all risk of snoring. As you sign your name, or, more likely, make your mark, if you never learn to write between potato plantings, the crowd leans in. Agnes, from her window, claims she can tell a marriage's future from the way the ink runs down the page. The local constable nods approvingly, happy to see everything in order, even if the only law being upheld is the one about not blocking the vegetable stall. Sometimes the contracts are surprisingly ambitious. There are stories of wives who negotiated their own terms. Husband must build new hen house by Michaelmas, or buyer agrees to 3 market day holidays a year. These agreements, while rarely enforced, at least give you something to wave in the air when arguments about who forgot to bring in the washing get heated. If you're lucky, the contract survives its first week without being used as kindling or repurposed for wrapping cheese. Not that any of this stands up in a real courtroom, mind you. If the magistrate ever asked to see your paperwork, you'd hand him a sheet so greasy it's transparent in places. He'd nod sagely, put on his glasses, and then quietly advise you never to mention it again. But for the crowd, the ritual matters. The contract, official or not, draws a line under the old arrangement and opens the door to whatever comes next. Of course, weather plays a role. More than one binding agreement was rendered moot by a sudden rainstorm, the ink blurring into a modern art masterpiece. In such cases, everyone shrugs, has another pint, and agrees to start over next week. Occasionally, a misplaced contract is discovered months later at the bottom of a flour barrel or stuck to the side of the dog's bed, at which point no one remembers who was sold, for how much, or whether anyone ever found the missing apron. In the end, the curious case of the market marriage contract is less about legal security and more about a sense of closure, or, at least, the illusion of it. You leave the square with your crumbly paper, your dignity mostly intact, and the hope that, this time, you're off to a better beginning, or at the very least, a drier one. Officially, wife sales are strictly forbidden. Unofficially, the local constable develops sudden interest in the pie stall whenever bidding begins. You watch as the law squints in your direction, considers intervening, and then decides paperwork is worse than public matrimony. If there's one thing that can halt a Victorian crowd, it's the heavy tread of authority, boots on cobbles, brass buttons glinting, and the stern face of the local constable as he surveys the chaos of market day. But, as anyone will tell you, there's the law on the books, and then there's the law as it's lived, particularly when there's pie involved. You stand on the auction block, the rope about your waist a little itchy, eyes darting to the edge of the square. The constable, Mr. Digby, is nowhere near the commotion. Instead, he's sampling apple tarts and pretending to admire the fishmonger's finest cod. Occasionally, he'll glance over, just long enough to establish plausible deniability, then return to discussing matters of great import with Mrs. Grubb at the bakery. Every now and then, someone in the crowd will nudge a neighbour, nod toward the uniformed presence, and whisper, "You'd think he'd do something." But everyone knows that something is likely to be a sigh, a shrug, and a slow meander away from the spectacle. After all, wife sales may technically be illegal, but enforcing the law means paperwork, angry villagers, and, worst of all, missing out on the last warm pork pie of the day. Meanwhile, the town magistrate makes a rare appearance, usually only if the crowd starts to get rowdy or someone drops a crate of eggs in the middle of a bidding war. Magistrate Biddle is a man who believes in the spirit of the law, which, in this case, means turning a blind eye as long as nobody ends up in the duck pond or sets fire to the cheese stall. He surveys the market through tiny spectacles, nods at familiar faces, and raises an eyebrow at anything resembling a scandal. But the most he'll ever do is clear his throat meaningfully and hope someone else sorts things out. There are rules, of course, though they're as changeable as the weather. Keep it civil, says the constable. If pressed, no fighting over bids, no selling anyone twice in one day, no livestock in the bakery, all fair, all flexible. If pressed about the legality, the authorities become masters of strategic blinking. The magistrate might say, "Well, it's not exactly allowed," then trail off, distracted by the sound of a fresh batch of scones hitting the bakery counter. You watch all this, bemused. You're technically breaking the law, but only in a way that everyone agrees to ignore. It's an unofficial tradition, a community performance where the actors know their roles and the police prefer a front row seat at the pastry stall to any starring part in the drama. On those rare occasions when things go wrong, say a particularly vocal dispute or an outraged vicar trying to halt the auction with a swinging Bible, the authorities spring into action, if only to restore order before the afternoon is ruined. They separate the parties, issue warnings, and sometimes, just sometimes, threaten to report this to higher-ups. But higher-ups are even less interested. They're probably still sorting out last year's goose dispute or reading up on turnip theft. By the end of market day, as the crowd disperses and the auctioneer counts his coins, the constable polishes off the last of his pie, and the magistrate returns to his paperwork, none the wiser, none the stricter. The law, it turns out, is mostly about maintaining peace, keeping the gossip contained, and ensuring that no one ever has to file an official report labelled wife. Sold includes apron. So you step down from the block, rope gone, future uncertain, and watch the local authorities stroll away, bellies full, consciences clear, and not a single line added to the town's already overstuffed ledger. In Victorian England, some things are better left unrecorded, especially if they interrupt tea time. You're not for sale today, just here for the show. You join the crowd, juggling roasted chestnuts and a strong sense of moral confusion. Do you cheer? Do you boo? Or do you just wonder how many people accidentally went home with the wrong spouse last year? Being a bystander at a Victorian wife sale is a delicate social balancing act, somewhere between being an audience member at the theatre and a judge at a pie-eating contest. You want to look interested, but not too interested. Sympathetic, but not so much that you get roped into volunteering for anything, literally or figuratively. First, there's the question of where to stand. Too close, and you risk being mistaken for a bidder. Too far away, and you miss all the best gossip. You settle somewhere near the bread stall, close enough to hear the auctioneer's booming voice, far enough to avoid a stray elbow or a wayward cabbage. From this vantage, you have a clear view of the merchandise, the soon-to-be ex-husband already practicing his single-man shuffle, and the peanut gallery of professional hecklers. Next comes the etiquette of snacking. Roasted chestnuts are the snack of choice, but they have a tendency to shed little bits of shell at the most inopportune moments, like when the auctioneer is announcing the starting bid. You try to eat quietly, but everyone knows the true purpose of the snack: plausible deniability. If someone accuses you of gasping in shock or snorting with laughter, you can always blame the chestnut caught in your throat. Moral confusion is part of the package. Do you join the chorus of oohs and ahs when the bidding heats up? Or do you offer a disapproving tut and a shake of your head, as if you only stopped by for onions and accidentally got caught in the marital crossfire? Some bystanders go for a theatrical display of hand-wringing, sighing about the state of things these days while secretly hoping for a bidding war. Others bring a notebook, ostensibly for recording market prices, but really to jot down the best one-liners for later retelling at the pub. The bystander's role also comes with its own hazards. There's always the chance of being mistaken for someone's long-lost cousin, a surprise bidder, or, worst of all, an interested party for next week's event. You've seen it happen. Last year, Mr. Puddlewick wandered too close to the auction block and was nearly sold alongside his shopping basket, only narrowly escaping by offering up a large sack of potatoes and a frantic denial. Gossip is the lifeblood of the bystander. Every muttered comment, every pointed glance, is stored away for future use. Did you see the way she rolled her eyes when the goat was mentioned? I heard she baked 3 pies for her new husband last week, 1 for eating, 2 for negotiating. By the time you get home, the simple afternoon at the market will have grown into a tale of high drama, outrageous bids, and a mystery involving someone's missing hat. Above all, the bystander's guide is clear. Never let on that you're enjoying yourself too much. Maintain a proper air of concern, but allow yourself a sly smile when the proceedings take an unexpected turn. Say, when the rope unravels or the auctioneer loses track of who bid what and has to start over from one wife, slightly used. As the crowd disperses and the newly reorganized families drift home, you linger a moment, chestnut bag empty, wondering what strange tradition you'll witness next. After all, in Victorian England, today's bystander is tomorrow's headline, or tomorrow's merchandise, if you aren't careful. So, as you wander home under a cloud of gentle scandal and roasted nut smoke, remember, the safest place in the marriage market is in the crowd. Just keep your hands in your pockets, your head on a swivel, and be ready with a polite excuse if anyone starts eyeing you a little too closely. Every now and then, the new husband turns out to be just as odd as the old one. Ex-husbands occasionally linger at the edge of the crowd, looking mournful or perhaps relieved, while everyone speculates whether he'll try to buy you back at next week's auction. It's one of those quirks of the Victorian marriage market. No matter how clear the sale, there's always a chance your past comes shuffling back with muddy boots and a new story to tell. You spot him near the bread stall, your ex-husband, pretending to be fascinated by the price of rye but really keeping one eye on your new domestic situation. Sometimes he wears his regret like an old coat, buttoned up and worn at the elbows. Other times, it's hard to tell if he's stifling a sigh of relief or trying not to laugh at the sight of you haggling over soup bones with your latest spouse. New husbands bring their own surprises. Maybe you've traded up for a man who snores in a completely new register, less wounded badger, more optimistic goose. Perhaps he has a fondness for collecting beetles or for reciting bad poetry before breakfast. There's always an awkward period of adjustment. 2 people tiptoeing around each other, quietly negotiating the household rules and comparing notes about whose mother-in-law is the most persistent visitor. The upside is that you get to reinvent yourself. Maybe this time you'll ban turnips from the dinner table or finally convince someone else to scrub the floors. The village watches all this with great interest, of course. Everyone loves a good sequel. And in a town where nothing stays secret for long, the return of an ex-husband is as good as a travelling theatre show. Children whisper, "Will she go back? Will there be a bidding war?" The local matchmaker rubs her hands together, delighted by the prospect of another round of shuffling. For you, seeing your former spouse brings up a whole tangle of feelings. There's nostalgia, certainly. The kind that softens old arguments and makes you briefly remember the good days, before the endless bickering about coal rations and the fate of the family chicken. But there's also satisfaction. You survived the market, the rope, and the odd looks from Agnes at her window. You made it to the other side, and whether this new husband is an upgrade or just a lateral move, at least you had a say in the matter. Sort of. Then comes the laughter. Not every memory is sad or awkward. Sometimes you share a knowing smile with your ex as the new man tries, heroically and in vain, to repair the teapot you both know is beyond hope. There are inside jokes that no market contract can erase. The way you both hated Mrs. Pratt's scones, the time the dog ate all the apples, that rainy Sunday you spent pretending you were rich just because the bread came out evenly sliced. Love in Victorian England is rarely straightforward. Sometimes you find yourself rooting for your own happiness from the sidelines, wondering if your new life will be brighter, funnier, or at least less filled with turnips. Sometimes the old feelings come back, unexpectedly gentle, like an old song played in a new key. And sometimes, as you watch your ex-husband fumble his way through the crowd, you realize you're finally ready to wish him well, or maybe just hand him a list of cleaning tips for his next adventure. As the market closes and the sun slips behind the rooftops, you and your new spouse, oddities and all, find your rhythm, laughter echoing down the street. You pass your ex-husband at the edge of the crowd. He lifts his hat, you give a polite nod, and for a moment you both appreciate the strange comedy of it all. In the Victorian marriage market, love and laughter always find a way to sneak back in. Sometimes right behind the bread stall, sometimes hand in hand with an ex. And if nothing else, there's always next week's auction. So tonight, as you sink deeper into your clean sheets, without a rope around your waist or an auctioneer describing your best features, take a quiet breath and thank your lucky stars for group chats, online dating, and the miracle of irreconcilable differences on paperwork. The next time your partner forgets to do the dishes, just remember, in Victorian England, someone's solution was to put you up for sale between a wheelbarrow and a slightly nervous goat. The history of the wife sale is both sad and hilarious, equal parts endurance, survival, and a weird sort of hopefulness. Because even in a society tangled up in social rules and moral panic, people still found ways to escape, to negotiate, to rewrite the script, sometimes in the middle of a muddy market square. There's a strange kind of resilience in that, a stubborn refusal to let circumstance be the last word, even if it means being auctioned off for the price of a decent pair of boots. So as you drift off tonight, remember the absurdity and strength it took just to make it through a single day in the past. You're descended from people who survived auctions, indignity, public scandal, and the world's worst mattress. If they could find a little hope in a hopeless moment, you can definitely survive a missed text or a cold cup of coffee tomorrow. Let yourself relax. Let the weirdness of history fade into dreams. And, as always, be kind to yourself and to anyone who's ever tried to love, leave, or start over in a world that didn't make it easy. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time. No auction required.